Okay, Poderistas, I caught a very special sneak peek of this next conversation, and it was pure fuego. Actress and activist America Ferrera goes one-on-one with Alexis McGill-Johnson. She's the new CEO of Planned Parenthood, and just as our reproductive rights are being scaled back in places like my home state of Texas, a state with a huge number of Latinas, this is the kind of conversation that you don't want to miss, not only because it's a very important topic, but also because the two take great care to highlight what mujeres like you and I can do to support women's reproductive health. Check it out.
Hi, Alexis. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know how busy you are and how important your work is, so it's an honor to have you having this conversation with us today. Welcome to the Poderistas community.
I'm honored to be here, and quite frankly, it feels really good this fall to be in community with folks who are building power and recognizing how important that is at these really incredible, critical moments in our country.
Well, let's just get right to it. There's a lot happening in your space right now, a lot happening for all of us, but recent events in Texas have really brought into stark relief the attack that our reproductive rights are under. Can you talk a little bit about Texas, what's happening there for some folks who just maybe don't know, live in other parts of the country and are not aware of what's going on in Texas? What's happening in Texas and how is that impacting the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So the Texas State Legislature passed earlier this year, at the kind of end of spring, a law called SB 8. And that Senate Bill 8 law is a 6-week ban, which means it bans abortion roughly after 6 weeks, when they argue you can experience cardiac activity in a fetus. And that law went into effect on September 1st. It is the first time a 6-week ban has ever gone into effect in the U.S. Many people don't know that they are actually pregnant at 6 weeks. That's just 2 weeks after a missed period. So literally de facto, in some ways, it made Roe meaningless for the people in Texas. That's 7 million women in Texas who no longer have access to a provider of abortion after 6 weeks. It means that the 85% of people who were coming to Planned Parenthood for abortion services were coming in after 6 weeks. They now need to travel out of state. It means that they need to identify resources to do so, take off work, get childcare, travel through a pandemic, because we're still in a pandemic. And it was really, it's just terrific, the impact. It's on top of a number of other restrictions that Texas had already imposed, like a 24-hour waiting period, a mandatory ultrasound, state mandated counseling, and the notion that effectively our ability to make decisions about our own bodies in Texas is no longer the case. The unusual thing about a ban like this, which is blatantly unconstitutional because it violates Roe, is that the state cannot be held accountable for enforcing it. Instead of enforcing the bad law, the state decided that it would rather empower private citizens to enforce the law, essentially like bounty hunters, vigilantes, by incentivizing them to surveil and harass people and giving literally complete strangers the power to sue anyone who is, quote, aiding or abetting anyone who receives an abortion after 6 weeks in Texas. And if they can prove it, they can get $10,000 for every successful claim. So, it put a bounty on the heads of providers, of patient support networks. It could be the person who counseled you, your pastor, it could be your Uber driver. We don't know. It's just such a strange provision that really has had a chilling effect on access to abortion in Texas.
And is this kind of tactic and provision unprecedented in the space of infringing on reproductive rights? Have we hit a new low or a new high in the attack against our reproductive rights?
Yeah, it absolutely. I mean, it is incredibly dark and devious. And, we asked the Supreme Court to weigh in, and the majority of the Supreme Court let the ban stay in effect while the lower courts continue to evaluate the law. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor, had an incredibly powerful dissent. Where she talked about this provision being just the height of cynicism, right? I mean, it's, instead of love thy neighbor, it is literally sue thy neighbor. It is, again, incentivizing the worst behavior. It could be your ex-boyfriend who finds out about something that could be abusive and can, empower him to sue you. You would be responsible for the $10,000 bounty that he would then receive, as well as his legal fees in doing so. So it really is incentivizing the worst of us at a time when, we've just gone through so much.
Right. And I know that this is so dark and no one likes to think about these things, but this is the reality for people and in their lives. That, another example is of, that rape or incest in the home would empower the rapist to sue the victim of the rape inside their own family and take away rights there. I mean, the extent of it just gets so sinister and so dark, and I wonder if people, if there's a part of this that people feel like, oh, well, the worst won't happen, or the worst can't happen, or that's just Texas, how does this pertain to me? Like, what would you say to that, to someone who feels like, well, this is Texas and maybe that's not so surprising? How does this impact, women all over the country?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is not just about Texas. This is actually a national issue. And part of the reason it is because, as you mentioned, there have been a number of crazy restrictions that we've seen over the years. In fact, 600 restrictions have been introduced just this year. 90 restrictions have been enacted in states across the country. But this particular provision, because the Supreme Court declined to intervene in stopping it, it means that there are 26 other states that are, essentially states that have anti-choice legislatures that would feel emboldened now to take this kind of law and run it through its state legislature. We're already hearing examples of that in states like Florida. So it's not just Texas. It's at our doorstep, where we are across the country. And what we are seeing is that this could actually be essentially expedite the end of Roe before the Supreme Court even has a chance to hear the current case that's on its docket now. The first case that has been taken up since Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, which is called Mississippi versus Jackson Women's Health, which is a 15-week abortion ban and literally goes to the essence of Roe, which is that we get to make these decisions, within a certain period of time. And so they are taking that right away from us, and they're doing it through this strategy. And I'm sure they will also be pressing on the Supreme Court in the Jackson Women's Health case too.
Right. I think that there is a false sense of security for women of a certain generation that this is constitutional law. The Supreme Court will have to defend us. But so much is happening at the local level, as you say. So when this kind of legislation shows up in our own backyard, what do we do about it? How do we fight on a local level? How do we organize on a local level to defeat these kinds of bans and this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing about when you say like of a certain generation, they thought, we settled that law and it is like codified and our constitutional rights are secure. And yet, like I'm 49. I'm like just a little bit older than Roe, maybe 5 months older than Roe. And so like the idea that the courts could be taking away or thinking about taking away like literally 50 years of precedent. It is kind of mind-boggling because most of us have grown up knowing that this was the protection, and yet every state has seen some kind of chipping away, or some states have been able to push the boundary to make sure that it's codified in their state constitution. But the reality is millions of women are living in states, 25 million women are living in states where if Roe is overturned, or this set of 6-week bans spawned by Texas happen, where de facto end of Roe ends, essentially we're going to be living in two countries, right? A place where you can actually get access to abortion if you need it, or a place where you will have to get out of state in order to get the kind of healthcare that you need. And we know it's going to it will impact people of color, right? Black, Latino, Indigenous communities, people with low incomes, people who live in rural areas. People who have money have always been able to get access to abortion, even pre-1973. They were able to fly to, New York or Puerto Rico or Europe or something like that. And so we know who it's going to impact. So it's so important for us to really educate ourselves about what is happening in the state, really hold our state lawmakers accountable, and demand of our Congress and our White House right now that they do some kind of intervention to make sure that these bans can't take hold. And so we are working with a number of organizations. We are meeting regularly with the White House and with congressional leaders. But it is up to us in every single state to be having these conversations at every level.
And speaking of, showing up and holding accountable, are there any particular actions at the moment, either on a local level or on a national level, that are putting on pressure that could help the problem, whether it's locally or nationally, that we should be aware of and that we should be throwing our support behind?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the wonderful thing is, and you've done this so beautifully, right, is that we all have our own platforms. We all have the opportunities to take actions, every single day, just by giving our voice, whether it's through social media, kind of educating our peers around what's going on, our parents, other folks who are engaged in the community around, like, what does it mean to have sexual and reproductive health care? Why is that so important? What kind of commitment are we giving it in terms of, where we are volunteering, where we are donating, where we are spending our precious time to engage, or our expertise to make sure people know. A lot of the reason why these restrictions have been able to take hold over the years is because the amount of stigma related to sexual and reproductive health care broadly, but certainly related to abortion. And so the kinds of stories that we tell, personal stories about our own experiences, 1 in 4 women has had an abortion in their lifetime. And so, that's a pretty normalized experience when you think about it, but we don't treat it as though it is a normal part of a healthcare, decision tree. And so I think the ways in which we show up, we tell stories, we kind of demonstrate the nuance and the complication, I think is really important, as well as, obviously engaging in as much of the democratic process as we can.
Right. I mean, the education that I've gotten on the ways that the attacks on reproductive rights work are that they're often obscure, and they're not a direct attack saying you can't have an abortion, so much as, we're going to empower people to sue you if you do. And another piece of legislation that I think has really limited access to reproductive health care is the Trump administration, Trump era gag rule. Can you talk about that gag rule, where we're at with it, and the impact that it's had on access to reproductive health?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trump administration put a gag rule on a program called Title X, which is the only federal grant program that's dedicated solely to providing individuals with comprehensive family planning, birth control access. So it's the nation's oldest and largest birth control plan, which is essential, right? I mean, like, We have made so many gains since our access to birth control, since the FDA first approved birth control 60 years ago. A third of women's wages, it's responsible literally for a third of women's wages going up. So it's obviously, the ability to determine when and where and if you will become a parent has so many other implications on you and your family and your community and your career. And so Title X is a big deal. It's really important. A lot of people, particularly low-income people, rely on being able to get access to contraception. And the Trump administration early on imposed what is called a domestic gag rule, which meant that it severely limited the access to the program. For anybody who is an abortion provider, it said that you couldn't receive Title X funds if you were going to counsel patients around, whether or not around what abortion was, or that as an option. And, we opted at Planned Parenthood, many other providers did as well, to stop taking the Title X money and to try to identify other sources to support the communities that we were serving, because we didn't want to, we didn't want our doctors to be gagged. We didn't want our doctors to feel like they couldn't give the full amount of information to their patients that they deserve and that they expect. And, that kind of policy also disrupts the trust between a provider and a patient. And we just found that to be completely unacceptable. But it has an impact, right? It's also impacting communities where there are STI, increases. We are in a pandemic. People were having lots of sex. They weren't able to get to the doctor, and they didn't know that they could get Title X in certain areas. And we've seen increases, right? And things that actually could be controlled and where communities could be supported. This kind of policy, we can see that we're still undoing the harm of the last 4 years. But it is really important, now that the Biden administration is in, they're in the process of rescinding the gag rule. It's taking some time to get the right pathway back into the programs, but they've also committed to, putting more resources in and expanding who is eligible and making sure that everybody has access to, to just basic sexual and reproductive health care.
So is there work there for us to do in terms of holding the Biden administration accountable to reversing the gag rule quickly, or do you feel that the administration is doing what they can as quickly as they can?
Yeah, I think that the administration is, I think we've seen a lot in the first few months of this administration. I think they are sexual and reproductive health champions. He and Vice President Harris have been incredibly vocal, even recently around the Texas SB 8 law. I think the most forceful we've ever seen them be. The Biden administration has introduced budgets without, what we call the Hyde Amendment, which is a ban on federal dollars, health insurance that goes towards abortion, introducing budgets, their budgets, without the Hyde Amendment attached, because they wanted to use and signal the budgeting process as, one that says budgets are moral documents. They demonstrate where our priorities are, where our morals are. And they wanted to be clear that they did not feel like having racist laws that impact majority Black and Brown communities and low-income communities was right. It's not the value that they held. And so I do think that they're being champions there. I think the more that they hear from communities about the importance of programs like Title X, the importance of identifying federal solutions to this crisis that we are now experiencing with respect to access to abortion in various states, the more they hear about these provisions, where states are being allowed by the Supreme Court to essentially circumvent, ensuring that every citizen has access to their constitutional rights, the more they will feel invested in engaging in the work. And so I do think it is incumbent for all of us to also tie the thread together. I was thinking just recently about the Texas law. We have this law that is really forcing people out of state. So what does that mean for somebody who is undocumented, who may not be able to travel out state? What does that mean for, for someone who is, will have to take days off of work and may not be guaranteed to get their job back? There are all of these considerations that I think we need the Biden administration to think about, and they need to hear from us in order to do that.
You mentioned COVID, the pandemic, and the impact that's had on reproductive health, what other impacts on women's bodily autonomy and women's access to getting the health care that they need? What other impacts have you seen coming out of the pandemic, and particularly for women in communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, at the beginning of the pandemic, the people, I live in New York City, the people who I saw getting on the A train every day were largely, women of color, because they were the ones who were going to the hospitals, going to the nursing homes, going to the stores and opening them up. They were literally the essential workforce. And they were the ones whose bodies literally were deemed essential, that there was no luxury for them to stay at home, not just even to take care of themselves, because they were needed to take care of keeping all of these places running that were essential. And that is not just New York, that is literally every state across this country. Women were driving those pieces, and mostly women of color. And then, we saw early on as well, a number of states like Texas, like Ohio, instituting these horrific executive orders that saying that abortion was not essential healthcare. It was not time sensitive. Right? This is from the state that just, enacted a state ban. It's like so crazy to even say it, right? It's like not essential. And so we had both our bodies being deemed essential and not being allowed, to actually have essential care when we needed it, just being gaslit, right? So, that plus the fact that so many of us are caregivers, right? We were homeschooling, we were taking care of our parents, we were making sure that, we were the first to drop out of the workforce because of the amount of responsibility that we were carrying. And, the emotional toll, the mental health toll related to that, I think is just, we're just uncovering some of that. And I think we'll be doing that for years to come. It's been trauma. But then you layer on, another set of restrictions on whether or not, we can make decisions about our own bodies. And you see just the compounded nature of the trauma. And, it's mind-boggling how cruel it is.
Well, I mean, everything that we've spoken about has so illustrated that reproductive freedom is inextricable from social justice, and that it isn't just a healthcare issue, it's a racial justice issue, it's a gender justice issue, it's an economic justice issue, it's an LGBTQIA issue. And I know that that's a big part of your background, a big part of what you've spent your career and your life researching and knowing about. How do you plan to bring that knowledge into your role at Planned Parenthood? And what do you hope to achieve for Latina and Black and women of color in our country and around the world in your new role?
So I love this question because I think it just speaks to the essence of who we are as women of color. We don't just identify in one category, right? We are women. Yes, we are women of color. Yes, we may be on, we may be LGBTQ, we may be disabled, we may actually experience, so many identities. And my hope is that Planned Parenthood is when we really center who our patients are and who the people who show up for us, who support us, who our partners are, that we are literally centering the people at the intersection of their identities and the intersection of their injustices, because that means that we are actually building a stronger bridge for a, multi-generational, multiracial, movement that is going to be incredibly powerful for, continuing to advocate for the freedom that we need in all of these areas. I think that question of, who will we be when we are free is really at the center of every single movement that you named. and our ability to kind of connect the dots there. And I know as a leader, what I try to do, and sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't, is just try to model, what does feeling free look like? I don't know that I will ever feel as free as I am in this moment, in this movement. Part of that is because, I don't know what freedom actually looks like. So I have to imagine it for myself and act in ways that kind of empower my staff and support, my partners to really show up in the strongest way possible.
Well, Alexis, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with all of our Poderistas. In the Latino community, there's so much stigma and fear, and also hesitation to even broach this topic in our communities, with our families, with our friends, to talk about our own experiences, and just trying to break through the walls of the taboo can be really intimidating and can make it feel not worth it, or like, what difference does it make if I have the conversation or don't have the conversation? And sometimes we just need to know that we're not alone in our stories and our experiences and our desire to see change happen. So I think this is a very worthy conversation for our audience. And I guess the last thing I would love to hear you talk about is, in this very dark moment, in this very dark week that was very scary and traumatizing and triggering for so many of us, how do you stay hopeful? How do you stay above the doom mentality that we're headed towards, the place of no return? Can you give us some hope?
I'm a student. I'm a professor by trade, so I'm a student of movements. And I go back and I look at the movements, and I see that it's always darkest before the dawn. Movements exist because of darkness and pain, but they also have this incredible imagination and light. And so I'm constantly thinking about, how do we transform that pain into purpose? How do we transform it into power? How are we transforming it into the promise that I know that we could all be? And, I have two daughters. They are 9 and 12. They represent that power. They represent that promise to me. And, I just try to anchor myself in knowing kind of how other folks have done it over the years, how our communities have literally made a way out of no way, have had that leap of a better future that has put them on a path to come to this country, or get brought to this country and have to find a way to make meaning. And I think that we all have that journey in us, just holding that this is our time to do it, our time to be responsible and stewards of that dream for the next generation. It's an awesome responsibility, but it gives me hope, because I trust and believe in the people who are around me, like you, who have used your voice in such powerful ways to really drive different narratives and conversations in a way where you didn't have to, but it was important to you. And I think that's the kind of hope that I'm constantly seeking out. Any touchstone like that keeps me going.
Well, thank you for doing the work on behalf of myself and on behalf of my 1-year-old daughter, who I hope will, one day be working alongside your daughters to do their part in keeping the movement moving forward. So thank you for all of your work. Thank you for your time and for the conversation. And please let us know how best we can mobilize and support the work and protect our reproductive rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karina Daza, and this is my song, Mujeres Will Riot. Canto con la voz de mi madre, con su pena y la de mi abuela y bisabuela. Algún día a mi nena le daré este grito de almas guerreras. Resistiremos, gritaré más. Nos dicen muy ruidosas, por no decir poderosas. Esto solo empieza. Cantamos con firmeza callaremos. Ni una más, ni una menos. No me quedaré calladita. No, 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 no me quedaré tranquila. I've seen what grandfathers give grandsons, their pocket watches, army knives, guns. But what women pass on each generation is advice on self-preservation. Resistiremos, gritaremos. Nos dicen muy ruidosas, por no decir poderosas. No daremos paso atrás, fuerte nos escucharán. We won't stay quiet. These mujeres will riot. No me quedaré calladita. No, 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 no me quedaré tranquila. They say we're too loud. They try to drown us out. We won't back down, no. Can you hear us now? Oh, we won't stay quiet. No, 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 no. These mujeres will riot. No me quedaré calladita. No, 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 no me quedaré tranquila.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Gonzalez, and if I had to think about the most powerful thing I've ever seen a woman do that's really had an effect on me, well, first of all, I have to mention my wife giving birth to our daughter, or she'd kill me. That was incredible. But I'd have to say probably the thing that's had the most effect on me is watching my mother raise my brother and I back in the 80s when she was a single working mom and had two very, very energetic young men that she raised. And to this day, my brother is now a celebrated surgeon, and I play dress up on TV. So jury's still out on how good I turned out, but she had everything going against her, I think. You know, my father, while being a great father, was in the military, and the fact of the matter is he wasn't there. And it really rested on her shoulders to raise these two young men, and I will be forever grateful. And it's something that whenever I look for motivation in my own life, and when things seem impossible, I look at what my mother went through, and she never made it seem like it was difficult. Looking back, had such a wonderful childhood, and it was really because of the strength of that woman.